G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. That's where I'm joining you from, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Just a few tips to help things run smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our panel today. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will remove you from the discussion. We don't want to do that, so please keep things polite and on topic. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website on the webinars page later this afternoon if you have to duck out at any time. And days and times do vary for our webinars, as you will know if you're a long-time watcher. So please head on over to the Australia Institute's website and sign up for our webinars and our newsletter if you haven't already, so you can find out all the details of our upcoming webinars. So before we begin today, I did just want to acknowledge that today's topic is about Australia's war crimes in Afghanistan. We understand that there are multiple major conflicts happening right around the world right now, including in Gaza and Ukraine, but those conflicts are not our topic for today, nor necessarily the expertise of people on this panel. So a reminder to please keep things on topic. But I'm really proud to talk about today's discussion and webinar. In just a matter of days, the first person will face trial in relation to Australian war crimes in Afghanistan, and that person is David McBride, the whistleblower who will be on trial, not any alleged war criminal themselves. David McBride is a former military lawyer who's alleged to have blown the whistle to the ABC, prompting the 2017 Afghan Files reporting, which revealed allegations of war crimes committed by the Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. Similar allegations about unlawful killings of civilians were made in the Brereton report in 2020, and McBride has been charged with 5 offences. And the case raises questions about what is really at stake when a whistleblower goes on trial. What it says about Australia, that the whistleblower is not a war criminal, that it is a whistleblower and not a war criminal who's facing these charges, and what it means for truth and accountability when whistleblowers face prosecution like this. So to discuss these questions today, I'm really delighted to introduce our distinguished panel. Rex Patrick is a former senator and submariner and was known as the transparency warrior during his time in federal parliament. Rex is the founder of the Whistleblower Justice Fund, a national campaign to help secure desperately overdue whistleblower reforms and fight for the rights of Australian whistleblowers facing court action. Hadi Marifat is director and co-founder of the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organisation, an independent, non-governmental, non-partisan and non-profit research organisation. Oh, sorry, put in the research there, that's us, the Australian Institute. They're a non-profit organisation committed to the struggle to promote democracy and human rights. Welcome, Hadi. Rawan Arraf is the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Justice, an independent not-for-profit specialist legal centre working to develop Australia's capacity to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes. Kieran Pender is a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, leading its whistleblower project to protect and empower Australian whistleblowers. Sharara Attai is an Afghan Australian human rights lawyer who is currently the Executive Director of the Islamophobia Register. Since joining the register in December 2022, Sharara has expanded the work of the register to incorporate education and training and law reform work. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and expertise. Kieran, I wondered if I might start with you and with the trial of David McBride that's due to start on Monday. How did we get to this point, and why is he being prosecuted for blowing the whistle?
Sure. Thanks, Ebony. And perhaps I just begin by saying that obviously, as this is a live case that begins very shortly, sort of there's some limits on what I can say in light of the legal elements of it. This is a hugely significant case that should concern all Australians because of the core of it, which relates to someone giving information allegedly in the public domain that was subsequently reported, which was some of the early significant reporting about Australia's misconduct, indeed war crimes committed in Afghanistan. Now, obviously, subsequently, since that reporting in 2017 by the ABC, we've had the Brereton inquiry, we've had the Ben Roberts-Smith federal court judgment that's provided a lot of additional detail. But some of the earliest reporting, in addition to other reporting done by the likes of Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters and so on, was done by the ABC with the Afghan files, which is alleged to have been leaked to the ABC by David McBride. And he is being prosecuted for that. The prosecution comes at a time against a wider backdrop of attacks on whistleblowers in Australia. We saw Bernard Collaery and Witness K prosecuted for exposing Australia's espionage against Timor-Leste in the mid-2000s. Witness K was given a suspended sentence. Bernard Collaery pleaded not guilty, and ultimately the Federal Attorney General dropped that case last year. There's another whistleblower currently being prosecuted, Richard Boyle, who exposed wrongdoing at the tax office. And then the David McBride case, most prominently, starting on Monday. These cases raise fundamental questions about democracy, transparency, and accountability in Australia when the people on trial are those who have sought to speak truth to power, help expose wrongdoing, and made Australia a better place as a result. We are all better off because we know about what's been done in our name, and we can demand accountability and we can demand justice. But why is it that it's the people who've done that, who've helped us understand what's going on, who've helped bring transparency and sunlight? Why is it they who are on trial, not the wrongdoers?
Indeed. And if I can just get you to just expand a little bit on the Whistleblower Project itself and why the Human Rights Law Centre has chosen to establish that program.
Yeah, so the Human Rights Law Centre recently launched a legal service to help whistleblowers because of the importance of whistleblowers to our democracy, to exposing human rights abuses, corporate wrongdoing, government misfeasance. It's really critical that we're protecting and empowering people who speak up. We have laws that say you can speak up and be protected in doing so, but those laws aren't working. So the coinciding of these prosecutions and the establishment of our service in some ways makes it all the more timely. But it underscores how damaging the mistreatment of whistleblowers is in Australia. Prosecutions are the tip of the iceberg. We also have whistleblowers being sued for speaking up. We have whistleblowers losing their job for speaking up. That has a huge chilling effect. And so I often reflect on what don't we know? What is going on in the shadows that as Australians we should know about, but we don't because people don't speak up. Chilling effect, it's a word that's often bandied around, but I see it every day in practice. I have clients who say to me they don't want to speak up. They are afraid of speaking up about serious wrongdoing because of these cases, because of the mistreatment of whistleblowers. That makes our democracy worse off. It's easy to think of that in the abstract, but just think of some of the scandals that have been exposed by whistleblowers. The ABC's done a great series recently on Background Briefing about different whistleblowers that have exposed some major things, had royal commissions sparked by whistleblowers, inquiries, reviews, most front pages. But what don't we know? Because this next generation of Australian whistleblowers is staying silent because in the face of the risk of prosecution, the risk of lawsuits, the risk of losing your job, it's very understandable that people would think, no, actually, I don't want to speak up. And that's not good for all of us.
Rawan, I want to come to you next. It's been 6 years since the Afghan files were kind of published via the ABC, and those allegations of war crimes were made. What has been done to investigate and prosecute these alleged atrocities?
Well, we've had several inquiries, and that's led to a very welcome process of criminal justice accountability, or a criminal justice process that's been set up, and we're only really at the very beginning. We needed to establish an Office of the Special Investigator because the AFP just did not have the capacity, the resources, or probably the skills to conduct these types of war crimes investigations. In fact, my centre recently just released a report saying that Australia needs a permanent war crimes unit so that in the future, if we have allegations such as this, we can act quickly and not let an accountability process take 10 years to take effect, 10 years from the start of, from the beginning of those types of, or the incidents itself that occurred. So we've had families in Afghanistan and Uruzgan in particular who've been waiting for so long to have some sort of accountability and acknowledgement of the harms that they faced. And we know in many instances those families were knocking on the door of the ADF and various other authorities, including the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, trying to make complaints about the impact of their loved ones for being taken away from them. So what's began really is a criminal justice process. We have the laws to prosecute persons convicted, charged or alleged to have been involved with war crimes. Now it's a process of investigating them and referring briefs to the prosecutors so that we can see prosecutions and trials of those people. We've only just seen the first arrest, the first charge of Soldier C, who's been named as Oliver Schultz. He's the one involved in the ABC Mark Willesee report people would have seen 2 years ago. And so it's a very long process. And it's just the start. Like I said, I think we should be very encouraged by this process. I've said it before, that Australia is one of the only countries in the West that has really reckoned with its legacy in this way, but there's still a long way to go. And I think the broader impact of this particular trial against David McBride, who, along with others within the Special Forces, was very courageous, and we should be proud of them for having come out and shed light on the allegations and the serious wrongdoing, I think sends a really wrong message, a serious injustice against David McBride for having exposed that wrongdoing, and we're going after him. It just is a serious injustice. And so I think, we need to be speaking up. The fact that the trial starts on Monday is very concerning for all of us, and what that means for our democracy, what that means for transparency in Australia, but also Australia's reckoning with its involvement in Afghanistan. I think this absolutely goes to the heart. The government may say it's not connected, but it is connected. It obviously is connected in so many ways. And we should really all make our voices heard against what's happening to David McBride.
Yeah, Rex Patrick, if I can come to you next. You're both a former member of parliament and a former submariner, part of the military. I guess if I can get your response to these prosecutions and to speak to the barriers that whistleblowers face in order to report this kind of wrongdoing, because I guess there's a twin role there that you might talk about. Coming to members of parliament is often something that whistleblowers do, but also your engagement in, I guess, the broader issues of transparency within government.
Yeah, look, I'll just pick up by recognising what Rawan said about us reconciling what happened in Afghanistan, and I just put it to the viewers that that would simply not have occurred had David McBride not put up his hand. And it's really important. You mentioned I'm a former member of the ADF. Lots of really good people in the ADF. A small cohort of people doing the wrong thing can tarnish the reputation of the entire Australian Defence Force, which does great work in a whole range of different areas. So there's great importance in making sure that we call these things out and do reconcile them. And we have to be grateful to David McBride for doing that, just as we need to be grateful to Richard Boyle for having called out the egregious use of garnishee notices inside the tax office, where basically the tax office was reaching into companies' bank accounts and just stripping funds as their method of debt collecting. And that's clearly a power they have, but must be used in a reasonable manner. And that's what Richard Boyle called out. Now, the problem that all of these whistleblowers are facing is that, and I'll abstract this a little bit, but if I'm in the military and I have a classified document, and that classified document says that or demonstrates or shows or grounds a claim that someone has committed a war crime, and I hand that over, having tried on several occasions to hand it over to people internally within the Defence Force, if I then hand that over to the media to try and finally, as a last resort, do something in relation to the crimes that are on the documents, because the documents are classified, it may well involve a breach of the law, a breach of the Crimes Act, for me handing that over. I'm not purportedly not allowed to exercise my judgment when it's got the word secret or top secret at the top and bottom of the document. And that ends up with someone potentially facing a charge, a criminal charge, and they may well be found guilty. And it's actually quite difficult for the courts because they don't want to open up the slippery slope by saying you can do anything unlawful as long as you're whistleblowing. But in circumstances where the only purpose for passing on the classified document was to reveal a war crime or to reveal the abuse of power, then that most people would say that's okay. It's like breaking the law to run across the road to help a child in need. No one's going to expect that you get an infringement notice for jaywalking when you do that. But that's in effect what's happened is people are focusing in on the jaywalking and not on the greater good. And the problem we have with that is that and as Kieran was sort of suggesting, we may have someone like David McBride or Richard Boyle ending up in jail, and that in itself is a tragedy for these heroes. But one person going to jail for blowing the whistle means there's several thousand people in the community who will no longer be whistleblowers. And we need to have strong whistleblower legislation, protection legislation. We need to have whistleblowers know that they are protected. We need to have people who are working inside government or inside corporations know that there are people that are around them that can see what they're doing, that are protected if they were to stick up their hand and blow the whistle. It's a deterrent. That's the primary purpose of the concept of whistleblowers, is to make sure that we don't have wrongdoing. And I'll just sort of finally hit the one of the cruxes of your question is there's a bit of a minefield in navigating the laws here in order to be able to properly blow the whistle without breaching some jaywalking code. And you should not have to be a King's Counsel or a senior counsel just to be able to blow the whistle. And that's why we've got this power that has been given to Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General, in Section 71 of the Constitution, that says if there's a prosecution that's not in the public interest, the Attorney General can stop the prosecution. And that's the exact circumstances we find ourselves in with David McBride and Richard Boyle, where if you narrow in, there might have been some jaywalking happening, but the much bigger picture is just clearly there's public interest in not proceeding down that pathway.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot to consider there. Hadi, I'll come to you next. These war crimes took place in Afghanistan during the war. Can you give us a sense of how these war crimes and now the fact, that they've been brought to light, are perceived in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Bunny, and thank you for having me. I think it's important that I also mention a little bit the context, in which these alleged war crimes happened. First of all, this happened in a context of a deep culture of secrecy. There has been fabrication made obviously in operational reporting and the planting of weapons at the sites of operation, and also dead bodies, to indicate compliance with rule of law. And we also know that, the ADF, that they have dismissed, complaints by victims when they actually made it, directly, to the ADF at that time, and that was not considered. And then we have also journalists, obviously, and then whistleblowers, helped, with exposing, this misconduct that happened, and obviously, pushing, for reckoning process. And we know that, Britain also thanked, the whistleblower for their contribution and their important role in shedding light on the wrongdoings. David McBride actually provided, documents to journalism in 2016, which became the source of, the AB's Afghan files, and showed misconduct by Australian forces in Afghanistan, and as well as organizational problems in the ADF. So looking at that, and also now looking, that David McBride is actually going to be tried, so I think, this is not in the interest of Australia, and is also not in the interest of this Australian public, to prosecute McBride, simply because, he's the first person, to go on trial in relation, to the war crimes committed in Afghanistan. And he's a whistleblower, simply to put it, simply like that. He's a whistleblower, not. And it is also a grave injustice, to put McBride in prison for doing the right thing, bringing, to the truth, to the public. Despite the fact, that, victims' families, they have made complaints, but I think it was later on, David McBride's documents and revelation, that helped, to understand, and to understand a little bit about the truth, what happened in Oregon. And remember, those poor families, they didn't know much about, their loved ones at first time, and what exactly happened to them. So what we are actually, trying, to advocate is, that I think, we need Australia basically to focus, and prioritize in, addressing the legacy of its military engagement in Afghanistan, and improve investigation, ensure prompt, effective, and adequate compensations to, to the victims, and as well as, reform, the ADF, to address systemic issues, not basically shifting attention, to somebody else, who was not actually the criminal. So instead of that, there are other important things, that Australia 4 to 5 years.
Might be our Canadian connection.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that, I wondered if that was my connection or Hadi's. Hadi, you appear to have frozen there for a minute. Do you want to keep going? And then I've just got a question for Sharara as well.
Yeah, I stop here. Yeah, sorry, it was my internet. I think it is still quite unstable. Yeah.
No worries. We'll come back to you in just a second. Sharara, coming to you lastly, last year, the Islamophobia Register released its 4th report on Islamophobia in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about what it found and what the implications for the ADF's relations with the Muslim community in Australia are as a result of these allegations?
Sure. So we found that, there were a lot of instances of Islamophobia reported to us, and research tells us that actually, despite what was reported to us, the majority of incidents of Islamophobia go unreported. So it paints a small picture of what's going on, but we simply don't know the full picture because most cases don't go reported to us. What we did find was that women are overwhelmingly the victims of Islamophobia a lot of the time. And, in relation to the ADF, in 2016, there was a study that was commissioned by the Australian Army showing that of the ADF personnel who were interviewed believed that Islam promotes violence and terrorism. And that figure went up to 91% for those who had actually undergone cultural sensitivity training. And the study found that anti-Muslim sentiment is strong, at least among some elements of the ADF, at the forefront of deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which are Muslim countries. So this study was published, back in 2016 during the Brereton report period. And in that same period that these war crimes were alleged to have taken place, we were seeing the introduction. I was a refugee lawyer back then, and we were seeing the introduction of a number of inhumane asylum seeker policies and the demonisation of asylum seekers in Australia, most of whom were from Muslim countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar. And in that same period, we were also seeing consistently negative media coverage of Muslims in Australia and negative political rhetoric about Muslims in Australia. So, I think it's very possible that Islamophobia and racism could have contributed to the way that these alleged war criminals viewed Afghan civilians.
Yeah. I want to go next to come back to you, Kieran. There's a number of questions in the Q&A box that I can see of people just kind of asking about the mechanics of these prosecutions and how such a prosecution like this gets triggered. So could you explain to us a little bit of how this came to be? Why is it that this went all the way when other things don't necessarily?
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. I'll make a few points and try and answer a couple of the questions that have come up. Just the wider context is that federal whistleblowing law says that you can speak up about wrongdoing. You can speak up internally first. You can speak up to oversight bodies. And as a last resort, or in certain emergency circumstances, you can go straight to the public, or after you've tried to speak up internally and to regulators, you can go to the public. And if you do all of that, you're both protected from prosecution, from lawsuit, from losing your job. And if you do suffer negative consequences, you can sue for compensation. That's what the law says on paper. Unfortunately, the federal whistleblowing law is full of loopholes and inconsistencies. It's overly technical. It's overly complex. The federal government admits the law is broken. The Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus KC, who introduced the law a decade ago when he was last Attorney General, has said that he recognises it's not working and it needs to be fixed. Unfortunately, we have these two cases where people thought they were following the law and now they find themselves on trial. You'd think that immunity in federal whistleblowing law would prevent these prosecutions. In the case of Richard Boyle, he argued in his defence that he was immune from prosecution, and the judge found that the immunity only protected the actual act of blowing the whistle, not relevant prior conduct. So Richard had gathered documents, recorded conversations, etc., to inform his whistleblowing, firstly internally, then to the tax ombudsman, and then ultimately as the last resort to the ABC and to the Fairfax newspapers. And the judge said the immunity only protected the actual whistleblowing, not things that were necessary to blow the whistle. He appealed. That appeal is pending. The Human Rights Law Centre intervened in that appeal. We'll get a judgment soon. In David McBride's case, he also argued he was protected by whistleblowing law. That was due to be heard last October. On the eve of that trial beginning, the federal government made a national security claim over key documents that meant that he was forced to withdraw his defence. That was a really extraordinary thing to happen because secrecy laws already protected that case. So if the government wanted key documents heard in secret, they could have done that. Instead, they prevented McBride from using them entirely. He had to withdraw his case. That means that he goes on trial on Monday without access to a whistleblowing defence. Both of those situations are extraordinary, but I think if we can zoom out to the wider backdrop, prosecutions happen because the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions thinks they have reasonable prospects of securing a conviction, and because they think it's in the public interest. we have consistently said it's not in the public interest to prosecute whistleblowers. And it's particularly extraordinary in the present case because the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, as people will remember, in 2019, the ABC were raided by the federal police in relation to this story. So the raid was in relation to the Afghan files reporting. The Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions reviewed the brief the police put together and said, we could secure a conviction of the journalist, but we don't think it's in the public interest to do so. Now, that was, of course, self-evidently the right decision. The ABC shouldn't have been raided in the first place, but it's very fortunate that the police and the prosecution didn't proceed with the case against the journalist. But if it's not in the public interest to prosecute journalists, how is it in the public interest to prosecute whistleblowers?
Mm.
Journalists except for Assange.
Yeah. Rex, coming back to you on that, I mean, one of the issues here, I guess, too, is the difficulty and the huge power imbalance that a whistleblower would face coming up against the Commonwealth government. You've done a lot of work over the years kind of trying to get, I guess, information exposed for the public in the public interest. How hard is it to go up against the Commonwealth government and in this kind of a case, or in smaller things like FOI requests and things like that?
Look, it's almost impossible because of the imbalance, particularly in the case of a whistleblower. Often they blow the whistle and end up losing their job. So they're unemployed, and now they end up facing litigation where they have to somehow fund legal representation, and it's near on impossible. I find myself in FOI proceedings up against the Commonwealth, and I've got a matter in the full federal court and one in the federal court, and a one-day hearing, it appears, in relation to one matter that I've got before the federal court is $186,000 of legal costs on the Commonwealth side. So whilst I have people who are backing me, and that includes, in one instance, the Australia Institute, but also the lawyers who often either appear pro bono or no win, no fee. That's not the problem, because you can get help. The problem is if you end up losing, you end up with bills for hundreds of thousands of dollars. In my federal court case, against the delays associated with the Information Commissioner reviewing decisions, that particular case, the Commonwealth racked up $900,000 in legal fees for a 2-day hearing. And it's fortunate that I managed to get a what's called a protective cost order to prevent me from facing those sorts of charges. But it still ended up costing $80,000. Luckily, again, I was indemnified by people like the Australia Institute, like the Grata Fund. But it's a huge barrier. And where Kieran's talking about loopholes, the basic principle needs to be that the legislation has to be so unambiguous that no agency of government or no corporation will bother taking on or taking to someone to court, because they can take the people to court on a technical legal point, and actually that finishes that person off even if they win the case.
Rawan, I want to come back to you now and talk about the actual war crimes, because you've outlined kind of that it's been a slow process getting the investigation underway until now, but it is happening. We had the Brereton report, which didn't necessarily name any Australian soldiers, but we also had a quite spectacular defamation proceeding against or from Ben Roberts-Smith, and a huge amount of information was put into the public as a result of that. Can you just have a reflection for us on, I guess, what it means when the prosecutions of the actual criminal case are so delayed? Does that mean then that there's a risk that things get out in other ways, or has that been beneficial, I guess, to exposing Australia's war crimes in Afghanistan?
It can be an easy and a difficult question. I think it's always difficult with with evidence. I mean, I think one of the things that is going to be important about these cases and many of the cases that we know of is that many of the witnesses are whistleblowers themselves, you could say, or people within the SAS or special forces who were witness to the cover-ups or had seen the actual crimes taking place either on video or in the actual incident themselves. So there should be, I guess, a lot of reliance on that kind of testimony. One of the things we're pushing for is for the participation. We're doing this with ARDO. We've done a lot of advocacy with government about and the authorities involved, so the investigators and the prosecution, about involving the Afghan communities and the victims themselves in some way in the proceedings. I mean, you know, in Australia, we've got a limited form of victim participation compared to how, for example, it would play out in the International Criminal Court. But nonetheless, I think that we haven't seen any indication yet so far as to how those families and communities will be able to participate in the process in some way. So back to, I think one of the important things about the defamation proceedings is that there was a lot of information that came to light, and I imagine that prosecutors would have and investigators would have been paying close attention to the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation trial. One of the frustrating things about the particular aspect of those investigations related to the incidents that involve Ben Roberts-Smith is that shortly after the verdict came out, the Australian Federal Police indicated that they had, well, there was an indication that they had bungled those 3 of those incidents, which is extremely frustrating. And we know also that the brief itself that the AFP sent to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution sat on their desk for 2 years. And I think that's striking in the sense that you have the CDPP chasing someone like David McBride, but then they sat on a brief to give, advice to the AFP about those particular investigations or those particular incidents. And it sat around, they didn't do anything on it. They didn't move on it for 2 years. What we do know about those incidents, just to wrap that up, is it's not all over in terms of those ones. It's now part of a joint investigative task force between the AFP and the Office of the Special Investigator. So we're hoping that they will be able to salvage whatever necessary information is required to be able to bring charges in relation to those specific incidents involving Ben Roberts-Smith. I mean, he's involved in others as well. So it's not like he's going to get off without a criminal trial. We're still hoping that all of those people alleged to be involved will, face the trial, including all the way up the chain of command, if the evidence so produces information about how far up the chain of command these allegations and wrongdoing was known. In terms of the majority of the incidents, it was unlawful killings, persons under the control. This is prisoners, people who were detained, and they were killed. That's the pattern of the killings and the allegations of wrongdoing, the allegations of war crimes that special forces were mostly involved in.
Hadi, if I can come back to you, I know during the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation trial, they had a lot of problems with, I guess, the fact that the Taliban had taken over Afghanistan again, and people who were part of that trial in Afghanistan, victims and I think the families of victims obviously found it extremely difficult to give that kind of evidence. How much is that a problem when we're thinking about these prosecutions going forward, that Afghanistan, essentially is back under Taliban control and people's safety is still really at threat?
Well, there is no doubt that the challenge is still there, given that the Taliban, controls, now the entire Afghanistan. And but I have to also say one thing, when it comes to these issues, obviously we should not, let's say, fall into the trap of the Taliban. But I think, in this particular case, there has been also possibilities, that since it is not obviously their crime, and of course their crimes, should be, investigated, so that's a different issue. So speaking of, the Australian war crimes, I think there are still possibilities, and we have recently seen journalists, that they traveled, to Oregon and managed to speak, with the victims. But I think it is also a question of, how, the Australian government should engage, with the Taliban, because, the Taliban regime is not recognized, so it's also not, the issue that we are, kind of, like to promote, because still, the Taliban should not be recognized, because of what they're doing to the country. But all, saying all of that, that doesn't mean, that the Australian government should not do, their own, task or job, And I think one of that is basically, the outreach, because there has not been, even an outreach, to the victims, and to, to assess, even the possibility of their inclusion in the whole investigation process, and later on, in the proceeding. So I think, that doesn't mean even there are, other possibilities. So you have, the UN over there in Afghanistan, you have, international humanitarian agencies, so there are possibilities, that the Australian government could reach out, to the victims in Oregon, and keep them informed about the process, And speaking obviously of the journalists who recently went to this area, and the victims, they don't know at all about what is going on in Australia. So I think, outreach is a key and important issue, and the Australian government must, do some kind of outreach with the victims.
Sharara, I wanted to ask you about whether it's kind of observable for the Muslim community in Australia that incidents of Islamophobia rise in concert with things like the Brereton report or the Ben Roberts-Smith trial, or those kinds of things. How much do you notice kind of increases associated with current events, or how much is it just kind of operating in the community at all times?
Islamophobia never goes away. It's operating at all times, but we certainly see a direct correlation between socio-political events and a rise in Islamophobia. For example, at the moment, given and I know we're not talking about Gaza, but given what's going on in Gaza, we've seen unprecedented levels of Islamophobia being reported to us. So there is a very clear direct link between I can't say necessarily that we saw a link between, for example, the defamation trial and the rise in Islamophobia, but certainly when there is major events, we do see a rise in Islamophobia.
And I wonder if you can just, for people who don't experience it, can you give us a few examples of what that is like for people? I know you kind of talked about the fact that Muslim women are some of the biggest victims of Islamophobia. I'm imagining that's because, for example, if you wear a hijab, you're quite visibly Muslim. But can you tell us what that is like for this community experiencing this in their everyday lives? What kinds of things are they experiencing?
Yeah, it's devastating. I think it shatters your sense of belonging, your self-confidence. And yes, Muslim women are visibly Muslim often, so they do unfortunately often bear the brunt of Islamophobia. We see all sorts of things. We see things like physical abuse, verbal abuse, vandalism, graffiti, threats to mosques and Islamic centers and Islamic schools. We see online hateful content as well. So it's really a wide range of the nature of these incidents are broad ranging.
Yeah, and as you said, it must be really damaging to that sense of belonging to your community. I imagine that would be really difficult to deal with. Do you also work on kind of education campaigns and things like that as a means of pushing back against that kind of bigotry?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've started to embark on education and training And I mean, one of the very interesting findings that we had in our last report was that the level of bystander reporting has dropped significantly. So the number of bystanders who are reporting to us is nowhere near the same as what it used to be. And that's very concerning for us, because we obviously don't want to see a situation where people are desensitized to Islamophobia or where that becomes normalized. And so one of our big projects that we're embarking on is a bystander activation program, which will include bystander intervention training.
Yeah. Kieran, I've got a question here that asks, is there any chance the Attorney General will intervene, or will the trial definitely start on Monday? Could you just speak to that briefly, please?
David McBride's lawyers yesterday, or the day before, posted on Twitter a letter that they'd received from the Attorney General in response to a request from the lawyers asking for the government to intervene. So under law, there are two people who can stop a prosecution: the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions or the Attorney General. The Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions has shown no sign of stopping this. There's been a significant number of requests, including from groups like Rex and myself, seeking, and Rawan and indeed Hadi, and we were all in Canberra advocating for this last month. The government has resisted those requests and formally declined to intervene in response to that letter. So it's Friday. David McBride's trial starts on Monday. There is, unfortunately, at the moment, no sign that that will change. So as things stand, David McBride's trial will begin on Monday. I understand there'll be a few days of preliminary legal argument, followed by a jury being impaneled later in the week. And then that's scheduled to run for a number of weeks. For those based in Canberra, there's a rally outside the court, sort of starting from 8 a.m. with speeches at 9 a.m. The trial starts at 10 a.m. I just do want to underscore, I know it's sort of, a lot of people have said it, and in some ways it's becoming a bit trite to say, but it just, again, I find astounding that the first person on trial in relation to the horrific conduct that Rawan and Hadi and Sharara have discussed. I think one of the reasons we were keen to have this webinar and have this sort of blended focus of the war crimes and the whistleblowing is because we can't lose sight of the underlying wrongdoing. Like that's what matters here. David McBride helped expose it, and his case is profoundly unjust. But what is even more unjust is the fact that we are focusing not on addressing the wrongdoing. And Rawan and Hadi have talked many times about the delays in accountability. The Brereton report had all of these recommendations, some of which have been delayed, some of which, issues of compensation and redress. The government is sort of blaming on the Taliban's takeover, but there are other ways it should be being pursued, which it isn't. But on Monday, the person on trial is the person who is alleged to have exposed the documents to the ABC, not any of the people who have alleged to have committed the war crimes. That is not good for our country. It's not good for our democracy. It's not good for accountability and transparency in Australia. But as things stand, it is going to happen.
Rex, coming back to you, if the worst happens and the prosecution is successful, I mean, what does that do for Australia's reputation? What does that do within Australia and then for Australia's reputation internationally?
Well, I think if we see David McBride being carted off to a prison, that will look extremely bad for what is supposed to be a compassionate Labor government. It will uncover the epitome of weak leadership from both Anthony Albanese and from Mark Dreyfus. This is a matter that needs to be settled. We can just imagine even the international effect as this sort of broadcast of our whistleblower being sent off to prison, being broadcast throughout the international community, and particularly Afghanistan, where the suffering that or the wrongdoing that David revealed took place. It's it's an unbelievable situation. It's actually hard to comprehend what's happened that the attorney can't see the public interest. Look, he's right in saying there shouldn't be a poll or there shouldn't be a vote on whether someone should or shouldn't be prosecuted. But my feeling is all of the people that are getting in behind the campaign that's been running, they're not arguing popularity. They're arguing about justice, righteousness, and about public interest. And it is just beyond explanation that the government has not done anything in relation to to this issue.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, just to think about that possibility of going to jail before any actual war criminals have is quite extraordinary when you take that to a potential logical end of this. And I can't imagine, being the government that presided over that, it is quite extraordinary. I do have sorry to go back to you again, Kieran, but I do have a question here from a couple of people wanting to know about what needs to change within our whistleblower laws to prevent this kind of stuff from happening again. What are the reforms needed?
Sure. So the Human Rights Law Centre, Transparency International Australia and Griffith University have published a roadmap for whistleblowing reform, which is available on our website, that sets out 12 key priorities for reform. The government's promised to fix the law, starting with the public sector. A reform is due next year. Then there's going to be a review of private sector whistleblowing law. There's a lot of technical detail that needs to be improved. The laws need to be made accessible and comprehensive, consistency at its heart. Beyond that, though, the real focus needs to be on more support for whistleblowers. We've been calling for the establishment of an independent statutory body, a whistleblower protection authority. That was a missing part of the National Anti-Corruption Commission that the Labor government established. The establishment of a NAC was a major step forward, but in the crossbench version of the NAC, which had been proposed under prior governments and indeed that Labor had voted for in the Senate, Dr. Helen Haynes's bill, the Greens bill, had a whistleblower protection body built into it, an independent body to oversee and enforce whistleblowing law, to provide support to whistleblowers to intervene in important cases. As I said, Labor supported that crossbench bill, but when push comes to shove, the whistleblowing body wasn't in the NAC. Indeed, Labor promised at the 2019 election to set up a whistleblower protection authority. They've now walked back on that promise and are currently only committed to considering it. And we've been promised a discussion paper by the end of this year, although I do note that Christmas is imminent. We need a body to do that. And I think you can imagine in these current cases, if there'd been an independent body for someone like David or Richard to go to get advice and support and guidance, in these cases, as I mentioned, the appeal in David's case, Richard's case, goes to really critical issues of federal whistleblowing law. The Human Rights Law Centre intervened in that case as a friend of the court, but having a body, a statutory body, a government body, to be able to participate in those proceedings and say whistleblowing law matters, we need a robust interpretation. Just as you have, we had a really important High Court case this week in relation to indefinite detention, and you have the Australian Human Rights Commission intervening, putting arguments forward, supporting human rights. We need an equivalent for whistleblowers. We see similar bodies in other countries, in the US, in Slovakia, in Ireland, and so on. We need a whistleblower protection body. But I guess my real concern about these prosecutions is how much it will undermine. I don't doubt that Labor is committed to whistleblowing reform. Unfortunately, they've walked back their commitment to set up a whistleblower protection body. I still hope that we will see that sooner or later. But if these whistleblowers are prosecuted and go to jail, the government's commitment to whistleblowing reform will be significantly undermined. And so that's why these cases are so important, because they're the tip of the iceberg, and there's this wider context that will be imperiled if whistleblowers go to jail.
Rex, I wanted to come back to you as well, just about the parliament itself. So obviously the government has a role to play here, but the parliament is often a place that whistleblowers come to as a last resort as well, thanks to parliamentary privilege and other things. What is the feelings of this current parliament and the prospect that, these kinds of reforms will be pursued through to the next election, given that, I guess, transparency and accountability were such big issues at the last election?
Look, we haven't seen the proper whistleblower legislation being put forward. There have been some minor changes to that, but there are a lot of things that the government talked about in opposition that simply haven't made it onto the legislative agenda. The fixing of the FOI regime, the fixing of donation laws. They never. You can talk loudly about these things when you're in the parliament, when you're in opposition. It really then comes down to the next question. Because you can keep talking about them, is where do those things sit on your priority in terms of the legislative agenda? Sadly, we are let down by Parliament. I think maybe I can tell you here, as long as the other 500 people keep this a bit of a secret as to how the Parliament really works. Next time when the viewers here look at the Parliament, look at Anthony Albanese standing up in the chamber, and when you look at him, look behind him, and there's a front bench of ministers all sitting there thinking, I want to be where the Prime Minister is. And then when you look behind the front bench, there's a whole bunch of backbenchers who are looking at the front bench saying, I want to be there. And when you look to the other side of the chamber, you'll see the opposition saying, I want to be on the other side of the chamber. No one seems to be in a place where they want to be. I say that because there's a particular sort of culture about the place. Lots of people go into that place. They want to do good. They actually work out they can't really do that much until such time as they become a minister. So they set off on that pathway and they don't disrupt, they don't call things out because they know that it will either cause problems with their pre-selection or will cause problems with their ambition to be a minister. The clearest example of this, and it sort of shocked me, but I got used to the idea, was whenever there was a division in the parliament, I would walk into the Senate chamber and I'd sit next to either a Labor or a Liberal person, depending on which way I was voting. And I'd say to my colleague, do you know what you're voting on? And they say, no, I've got no idea. Labor or Liberal members walk into the chamber, they look to where the whip is sitting and they just go and sit on that side of the chamber. Look, in some sense, that's a bit of an ad for independents who absolutely know what every bell rings for, and they always stand up because they're not trying to climb to the top of a particular tree. But that's the problem we've got. There's actually a lot of people inside the parliament that feel strongly about this, but they just won't say anything because they've got to stick within party lines. We've got the Liberal Party who don't want to deal with this, and we've got the leadership of the Labor Party that don't think this is important enough. Mr. Dreyfus has been saying that he can only do this under exceptional circumstances. Now, I think people might well argue that these are exceptional circumstances, the David McBride case and indeed the Richard Ball case. But actually, when you go and look at the legislation, the words exceptional circumstances do not appear in the Judiciary Act. It's a made-up word. It's a coward's shield being used to not exercise a power in circumstances that I described before, where people may well have technically broken some law on the way to doing something really, really good. And the disappointment that's coming from the Parliament at this point in time, and there is no judicial intervention in relation to the Attorney General exercising the Section 71 power. The courts recognise it is not their role to decide who is prosecuted or for what. that is there is the only person the Attorney General is responsible to in the exercise of Section 71 of the Judiciary Act, the power he has to drop these prosecutions, is the Parliament itself. And did we see anyone getting concerned about the exercise of that power in relation to Bernard Collaery? The answer to that is no. And the answer to that for David McBride would be no. And the answer to that for Richard Ball would be no. And it's just a great disappointment.
Thanks, Rex. I want to thank everyone who has joined us today. We've had over 500 people on with us live today and close to 1,200 registered, and we'll be able to access the video recording of this. I want to thank all of our panelists today. Please thank Rex Patrick, former Senator and Transparency Warrior, Hadi Marifat, Director and Co-founder of the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organisation, Rawan Arraf, Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Justice, Kieran Pender, a Senior Lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, and Sharara Attai, Executive Director of the Islamophobia Register in Australia. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your fantastic questions and for your interest today. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we consider this and our webinar series a really important part of keeping the Australian people involved in our democracy and in these big and important issues. Democracy isn't something that just happens at election time, but something we can all participate in all the time. So thanks for your interest in coming along today. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. And next Thursday, the 23rd of November, we're going to be talking to Executive Director and founder of the Plastic Free Foundation, Rebecca Prince-Ruiz, and Director of our Waste and Circular Economy program, Nina Gabor, about making a plastic-free Australia. You can find that and more of our events and webinars at australiainstitute.org.au. Head on over there. And please look up the websites of everyone that we've spoken to today and head on over to the Human Rights Law Centre to figure out how you can help the Whistleblower project as well. Thanks very much, everyone. We will see you again next week. Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.